Dear students, today we shall be talking about the fish migration. But before, it is my request to you all to like and subscribe my channel BioLearnia. Before proceeding to the fish migration, we shall be having an idea that what migration is. The migration is derived from the Latin word migrare, meaning to go from one place to another or to travel, and is used to represent long journeys, particularly by animals such as fishes and birds. Now, when we talk about the migration, it is a movement of either people or animals from one area to another. Migration can be used for the journey from one place to another for the act of the movement. Now, when we try to explain the migration, there are the varied group of stimuli in response to which the individual organisms move. And when such movements result in temporary or permanent absence from one home range and establishment of the residence in another, the resulting movements is said to be migration. जब एक ऑर्गेनिज्म किसी पर्टिकुलर स्टिमुलाई के तहत इधर से उधर जाता है और फिर जाकर वापस आता है और थोड़ी देर के लिए वो अपने उस परमानेंट होम से दूर रहता है, मगर फिर बाद में फिर वापस आता है अपने उसी शेल्टर की तरफ, अपने उसी होम की तरफ, हम ऐसे प्रोसेस को माइग्रेशन बोलते हैं. When we talk about the migration in the case of fishes, and mostly we say that migration is a two-way process. It is a two-way journey. And migration of the fish is defined as a class of movement which involves a long journey to a definite area for some purpose and impels the migrants to return to the region from where they migrated. That is, there are three important things. One is that the journey is long. Secondly, there is a definite area, to a definite area, that is, the area is defined to where they have to move. Thirdly, there is some purpose, that is, there is some purpose for the migration. And fourthly is that these very migrants, they come back, they return back to the region from where they migrated. So the purpose of the journey is mostly breeding and feeding. I told you that the migration is a two-way journey. It includes the emigration, that is this emigration that is to move outward, or we call it as the outward journey, and the second, immigration, we say it is the inward journey. The fishes are notable for the migration for the purpose of spawning. The inherent purpose of the migration is still unknown. In broad sense, when we try to define migration, it was defined by the Cohen as the migration which is a periodic passing of the animals from one place to another. So Cohen defined this very migration as the periodic passing of the animals from one place to another. It is a regular to and fro journey. So we cannot say it is only a one-way journey. It is regular two-way journey, either seasonal or annual. Outward journey from the feeding ground to the breeding ground, it is called emigration, as I told you. The outward journey from the feeding ground to the breeding ground, it is called emigration, and inward migration is actually the return journey from the breeding place to the feeding place back. We also called the feeding place as the shelter place also. So they pass their unfavorable climatic condition and they immigrate back. So the migration is confined to, so when we say migration, it is confined to the rhythmic, rhythmic movement, and it is a two-way journey. So it is always rhythmic, that is inward, inward and outward, or outward and inward journey. So it is going out and coming back. So that is why we call it as the two-way journey. When we talk about these very fishes, generally, these fishes restrict their movement within a small territorial limits and do not go out of their home ranges. Mostly when we talk about the fishes, most of the fishes, they are restricted to their small territorial limits and they do not go out of their home ranges. But there are certain fishes which travel long distances. They move from one place to another in search of food and in search of the mate, or you can say for the purpose of breeding. So this is the movement of the large number of the species, large number of the fishes for the purpose of feeding or spawning. So that is why we call this very process as the migration. This very migration can take place, this very migration can take place vertically as well. That is, there are certain fishes which move from the you can say the column zone to the pelagic zone for the purpose of getting food in the form of the phytoplanktons as well. There are certain mesopelagic fishes which live in the deeper waters, but they come onto the surface for the feeding on the phytoplanktons, because phytoplanktons are not abundant in the mesopelagic or the, you can say, benthic zone. So this very vertical migration can also take place in the case of the deep sea fishes as well. When we talk about the Thomson in 1952, he defines true migration as the seasonal movement that implies return to the starting point. So Thomson in 1952, he defined migration as a seasonal movement that implies return to the starting point. And then another scientist named as the Hardin Jones in 1968, he defined migration as the class of the movement which impels migrants to return to the region from which they have migrated. So these definitions are somewhat similar, but a little bit presentation is different. That in this very Hardin Jones 1968, he defined migration as a class of movement which impels migrants to return to the region from where they migrated. So this very definition envisages a general definition and defines migration as the return to the original place. And similarly, Baker 1978, he gave a more general definition and he defined migration as the act of moving from one spatial unit to another. So this Baker 1978, he defined the migration as the act of moving from one spatial unit to another. Heap in 1931, he was one of the scientists who worked on the migration of fishes, and he tried to define the migration as the class of movement which impels migrants back to the region from where they migrated. So on the basis of the objective and the need, the migration in the fishes can be classified into different types, such as alimentary or the feeding migration, gametic or spawning migration, climatic or seasonal migration, osmoregulatory migration, and juvenile migration. So let us have a little bit of idea that what all these migrations do mean to us. The first of all, we shall be talking about the alimentary or the feeding migration. We also call it as the alimental migration, because this very migration takes place in the fishes for the purpose of feeding. So in high populations, in the fishes which have high populations and they exhaust food resources quickly, such migration takes place in those very fishes where in the food resources exhaust quickly. That is why this very migration takes place in order to search the food. So therefore these very fishes must migrate constantly in search of the new feeding resources. Such migration takes place in the case of salmons, cods, swordfish, which constantly migrate for the food from the one place to another in the sea. Then we do have the spawning or the gametic migration. We also call it as a gametic or spawning migration. So this migration takes place in the breeding season in those fishes which have the spawning grounds far away from the feeding grounds. So migratory fishes such as eels and salmons and large number of riverine fishes, they spawn in the tributaries of the rivers, in hills, and migrate in large numbers for laying eggs in these oxygen rich waters. So we are well aware of all those very fishes which move from the sea to the hill streams to the higher of you can say rivers just to lay eggs, because they lay eggs there to have the waters which is totally you can say free from the predators. And secondly, they have the abundant phytoplanktons there, and thirdly, they have the you can say they have the oxygen rich water. So in order to lay eggs in these very waters which are having enough food, which are having oxygen rich environment and predator free environment, that is why these very fishes lay eggs. They go to lay eggs in these very upper areas. We call such a kind of migration as the gametic or the you can say spawning migration. Secondly, we do have the climatic or the seasonal migration. We do have the climatic or the seasonal migration, as the names implies that this is because of the season, this is because of the climate. So the seasonal migration takes place in those very fishes that inhabit the arctic areas, wherein summer climate is conducive and the food is abundant. But as the winter approaches, the temperature falls below zero and the food becomes scarce. So these very fishes which are unable to find their food in the zero and the minus temperatures, so that is why these very fishes must migrate toward the subtropical and the tropical areas in order to escape the extreme weather conditions, in order to escape the scarcity of the food, in order to escape the harsh environmental condition. They move from this very place to another place to avoid the harsh environmental conditions. The another kind of migration, we call it as the you can say we call it as the recruitment or the juvenile migration. We also call it as juvenile migration. Herein, this very migration, it involves the larval stages of the fishes which hatch in the spawning grounds and migrate long distances in order to reach the feeding grounds, or the feeding habitats from where their parents started. We call such a migration as the juvenile migration. Many times this is also called as the migration, because this takes place when the large number of larvae move from the nursery habitat to the habitats of the adults, which may sometime be distinctly different. So, for example, in the case of adults of the eels, they live in the rivers in Europe and America, but the larval stages, they live and grow in the sea and migrate to reach rivers again, which may take 1 or 2 years. We call such a migration as the recruitment migration, or the you can say juvenile migration. The another kind of migration is osmoregulatory migration. Migration. There are certain fishes which are adapted to live in the marine environment, and some are adapted to live in the freshwater environment. But in some of the migratory fishes, the larvae of these very fishes, they are adapted to live in the vice versa environment. That is, the larvae of the marine fishes, they are adapted to live in the freshwater, whereas the larvae of the freshwater fishes, they are adapted to live in the marine waters. And when they have to come back to their original environment for which they are adapted, they change their osmoregulation pattern. So in order to migrate, for the water and electrolyte balance from the sea to fresh water or from the fresh water to sea, this very kind of migration is called as the osmoregulatory migration, in order to maintain the electrolyte balance and in order to come back to their original, you can say, physiological condition. There are different migratory movements in the case of fishes. One we call it as the drifting movement. Now, this is the drifting movement. So when you simply have to keep in mind the drift when an organism cannot swim against the current of the water, but it goes along the current of the water. So towards the current of the water, when the fishes are being drifted toward the current of the water, we say it as a drifting movement. So they drift along the current of the water. We call it as a passive movement of the fish, because they do not swim actively, but they are passive in swimming. They are being drifted along the current of the water. The second is, we call it as the dispersal movement. We call it as a dispersal movement. It is a random locomotory movement of the fish from a uniform habitat to the diverse direction. So we call this very dispersal movement. We also call it as a random, you can say, locomotory movement, wherein the fish randomly moves from a uniform habitat to the diverse direction wherever they direct themselves. The thirdly, we do have the swimming movement. It is an oriented movement of the fish. That is, it is a oriented movement of the fish. It is either towards or away from the source of the stimulus. Towards or away from the stimulus. So we call such a movement as a swimming movement. Then we do have another important, you can say, movement. We call it as the detonant and the contranant movement. Now, when we talk about the detonant movement, it is an active swimming movement. This very detonant movement is swimming with water current, while the contranant is swimming against the water current. So we also call the swimming with the water current, but swimming, it is also swimming. In the drifting and the detonant, there is a difference. That is, in the drifting condition, the fish is passive, that it is not swimming, but the current is taking this very fish along with itself. But in the detonant, the fish is also swimming toward the current of the water, but in the contranant, you can say, movement, the fish is swimming away from the current, that is, against the current. So these are the migratory movements in the case of fish. Either it can be drifting movement, it can be dispersal movement, it can be swimming movement, and the movement can be detonant as well as the contranant movement. Then there are different types of the fish migration, and these are the actual fish migration, that where this very migration takes place. For example, we do have one of the important migrations types, that is diadromous. Diadromous means two-way migration. It can be anadromous and it can be catadromous. That is, if the migration is from sea to freshwater, it is the anadromous migration. That is, we call it as the upward movement. Upward movement. When we say catadromous movement, it is from the freshwater to seawater. We call it as the downward movement. Ana means up and kata means down. So then the second migration, we call it as the Potamodromous. Potamodromous migration takes place in the freshwater, that is within the freshwater. When we say Oceanodromous, it takes place within the seawater. Then we do have the longitudinal migration, that is, it takes place from the north to south direction or south to north direction. Then we do have the vertical migration, that is upward upward or downward migration, that is towards the surface or towards the column or the bottom. Then we do have the shoreward migration as well, that is toward the shore of the seas, toward the shore of the rivers as well. We call this as the shoreward migration. Let us discuss these one by one. The first of all, we shall be talking about the diadromous migration. That is this very migration. When I say diadromous, this very migration is between sea and the freshwater, either from the sea to fresh or from the fresh to seawater. And most of the fishes are restricted to either freshwater or the seawater. But there are certain changes in the habitat that may cause osmotic imbalance in those very fishes. However, there are some fishes which regularly migrate between the sea and the freshwater and have the perfect osmotic balance. They are called as the true migratory fishes. So there are certain fishes which cannot cope up with the you can say regulation if they are moved away from the seawater to the freshwater or freshwater to the seawater. They are unable to cope up with these very environments because they are meant to live in the seawater and some are meant to live in the freshwater. They are unable to adjust their osmotic, you can say, concentration. But there are certain fishes which are adapted to move in between, that is sea and the freshwater or freshwater and the sea, and they maintain the perfect osmotic balance. That we call them as the true migratory fishes. And this very migration is of two types. We call it as the anadromous migration and the catadromous migration. Now, what is this very catadromous migration? When I say anadromous migration, sorry, first of all I shall be talking about the anadromous migration. This very anadromous migration, it is derived from the Greek word that is anadromein, which means to run upward, and or it is also, the term can also be used as ana means up and dromos means to run. That is up running or to move up from where? From the sea to fresh water. So that is why it is called as the upward movement. So it is the migration of the marine fishes from the sea water to the fresh water for the purpose of spawning. So fishes spend most of their life living and feeding in the sea. These very fishes, they spend most of their life living and feeding in the sea and only migrate during the breeding season to the river for the purpose of spawning, because they have a particular breeding ground there. They have the particular spawning grounds there. Now, when we talk about these very salmon, they migrate for the breeding during the winter from the sea to the river, and they undergo certain physiological changes also. They stop feeding during the journey. They change in color, their gonads mature. So there are different kinds of, you can say, physiological as well as the morphological changes which take place in these very fishes to for the purpose of the spawning. They select suitable spawning ground and make the nest there, and the female lays eggs and the male releases the milk over it, and the juvenile are hatched, and these very juveniles, they come back to the sea. So this is the anadromous migration actually. So there are different examples of the anadromous migration. There are examples: sturgeons, Atlantic salmon, the Pacific salmon, hilsa, lamprey. They are the examples of the anadromous migration. Now, what is this very anadromous migration? It is actually the movement of this very fish to the freshwater for the purpose of spawning, that is to lay eggs. And then when these very larvae, they return back to the place from where the parents started their journey. But actually it is the parent which is moving toward the breeding ground. That is why it is called as the anadromous migration. So we do have the another kind of the migration, we call it as the catadromous migration. Cata means down, and the dromos means running, or it is down running, that is from the fresh water to the sea water. Now here what is going on? It is the parent which is moving from the fresh water to sea for the purpose of breeding. Now it is moving from the fresh water, that is from the fresh water, this very fresh water, to marine water to lay eggs. Now here the eggs are in the marine water. So if the eggs are in marine water, they are catadromous. In the earlier case, what was that? The eggs were laid in the fresh water. That is why it was called as the anadromous migration. So before and during migration, there are certain, you can say, first of all, we shall be talking about this very migration, that it is the migration of the freshwater fishes from the river to sea for the purpose of breeding, breeding in the season of the breeding, or in the season of spawning. And mostly it is the eel, that is anguilla. There are many kinds of the eels which undergo such kinds of the migration. There are European eel, we call it as the anguilla or anguilla vulgaris. There is American eel, we call it as the anguilla rostrata. They migrate from the continental waters to the Sargasso Sea of Bermuda in the South Atlantic for the spawning, crossing the Atlantic Ocean. So it is mainly asked in the examination multiple choice question that where they migrate, that is from where to where they migrate. They migrate from the continental rivers to the Sargasso. This is the place where they move. This is the Sargasso Sea. This is just off the Bermuda in the South Atlantic. So where is Sargasso located? It is located in the South Atlantic for the South Atlantic, just crossing the Atlantic Ocean. There, the Sargasso is present off Bermuda in the South Atlantic Ocean. So before and during spawning, some physiological changes they occur in their bodies just like that of the anadromous fishes. They deposit large amount of the fat in their bodies, which serve as a food during the journey because their journey is very long. So the color changes take place. It changes from the yellow to metallic silvery gray. Their digestive tract shrinks, they stop feeding, their eyes get enlarged, and the vision sharpens. And other organs they also become sensitive. The skin they serve as the respiratory organ, and then gonads they get matured and enlarged, and when they lay eggs they are fertilized by this by the their counterparts with the milk, and after spawning they usually die, and the larvae which hatch out, they develop into the young eel, and they finally return to the river again. So this kind of migration is called as the catadromous migration, where the parent they move from the fresh water to the marine water to lay eggs by undergoing different morphological and the physiological changes, and then the larva they move back to the sea from where the parents started their journey. So this kind of migration is called as a catadromous migration. Then we do have the potamodromous migration. Potamodromous migration. Then, as I told you earlier, that this very potamodromous migration we usually use this very term that within the fresh water. So when the fishes migrate from the one freshwater habitat to the another, that very water body is also freshwater water body. For the purpose of spawning, we call it as the potamodromous migration. So this kind of migration is called the potamodromous migration, which takes place within the freshwater. So it moves from the one freshwater body to another freshwater body, or from the one freshwater habitat to the another freshwater habitat, just for the purpose of the spawning. And there are about 8,000 known species, more than 8,000 known species that migrate within the lakes and rivers. So they move from the lakes to the rivers, or from the rivers to the lakes, generally for the food on daily basis. That can be even the daily basis, as the availability of the food that differs from the place to place. That is, if it is lesser in the lake, they move to the rivers. If it is more less in the rivers, they move to the lakes, because the lakes and the rivers many times they are interconnected, and they change their route, and thus this very migration is called as the potamodromous migration. These very fishes also many times migrate to lay eggs in the places where oxygen concentration of the water is more, and where the abundance of the food is very nice, and the juveniles when the juveniles hatch out of the eggs, they are safe and secure, they are having good oxygen, they are having the good food to eat. Then another kind of migration, we call it as the Oceanodromous migration, that is within the seawater, within the, you can say, salt water. So this very migration is from the seawater to the seawater. So within the seawater, that is within the seawater. So there are no barriers within the sea, and the fishes have learned to migrate in order to take advantage of the favorable conditions. So they move within the sea from the one place to another, or from the one habitat to another habitat, just to secure the spawning grounds or the feeding grounds. So there are about more than 12,000 marine species that regularly migrate within the seawater. There are herrings, we do have the sardines, mackerels, cords, then roaches, tunas. They migrate in large numbers in search of the food by shoaling. That is what is shoaling. Shoaling is the there are two terms that you should, every fishery student must be having the knowledge about. That is, the one is shoaling and other is schooling. So the shoaling is the migrating together socially but without coordination. That one fishes, there are different groups of the fishes which are living together, so are different individuals which are living together, so this is shoaling. They are migrating together socially, but there is no coordination in them. But when I say schooling, they swim with high degree of the coordination, and they have the synchronized maneuvers. Now, you must have seen in the documentary of on the TVs that there are certain group of fishes, when the shark come, they move together in one direction, and then again they move together in another direction with the great extremity of the coordination. This is called as a synchronized maneuvering. So the shoaling is without, you can say, coordination, but schooling is having the coordination of par excellency. So another, we call it as the latitudinal migration. Now, what is this very latitudinal migration? When we say that the migration of the fish which takes place from the north to south, north to south, and vice versa, or from the south to north. Some of the fishes, they move from the north to south, or from the south to north waters. So we call this very migration as the latitudinal migration, such as in the case of swordfish as well. And there is certain migration which takes place, we call it as the vertical migration. That is, I earlier told you, that is up and down, that is down and up, that is toward the surface and toward the bottom. We call such a migration as the vertical migration. It is a daily migration of the fish from the deep to the surface and vice versa, for the food, for protection, for swimming. And for example, I was telling you about, there are certain mesopelagic fishes which move to the surface at night to feed on the phytoplankton. So this kind of the migration can be called as the vertical migration. Then there is the shoreward migration. This very migration takes place in case of the eels. That is, many times these very fishes, they migrate from the one pond to another pond via moist meadows. So whatever the, you can say, the wet grounds they find, they move through these wet grounds to, from the one pond to the another pond, or from the one water body to another water body. This very kind of migration, we call it as a shoreward migration. Then there are many kinds of the fishes which are migratory in nature. But one thing is fascinating to know, that how we study these very fishes are migratory or not. Now, how would the scientists have known that okay, these fishes are migratory? Actually, there is a method called as the marking and tagging. So they mark the fish or they tag the fishes. Today, the technology is very advanced that we do have the GPS tags. We put on the GPS tags to the fins of the fishes, or to the places which is not so irritating to the fish, or the fish does not have the hindering. The fish swimming does not hinder. So It is tagged, the fishes are tagged with the GPS locator, and the fishes are, you can say, seen on the screen of the monitor, that where the fish is moving. So on the basis of these very marking and tagging, the scientists came to know, yes, there are certain fishes which are migratory in nature, that is, they move longer distances, they move from the one water body to another, or they move from the sea to the freshwater, or the freshwater to the sea. So this very marking and tagging, they give information about the fish migration. So information about the pattern of the fish migration, its direction and the speed of the movement, it is actually studied by this very method called as the marking and tagging. And then followed by the recapture, we capture the fishes again, we study their marks, and then we release them again. So these very marks or tags, they must be easily identifiable, and they must stay with the fish till the end of the study, so that the study is not, you can say, incomplete. Each and every aspect of the migration is studied, and many types of the tags, they have been developed for the attachment to the fish for easy recognition as well. And most of the migration that occurs at the regular intervals. Um, Scientists also studied that some of the migration that occurred at the regular intervals, that there is a particular periodicity of the migration. That is, the fishes, they migrate um, during a particular season, or during a particular month, or they yearly or biannually or longer. So there is a particular pattern in the migration of the fishes. So such as Pacific salmon, they remain at the sea for several years before returning to the spawning grounds. So they remain in their feeding grounds for several years before returning to the spawning grounds. And then when we talk about the eels, they spend several years, up to 20 years, feeding in the fresh water before they take their onward journey towards the sea. So they stay in the freshwater for about 20 years, and then they migrate to the sea for the purpose of the breeding. So there is a particular periodicity in the migration of the fishes as well, and this very periodicity varies between different species and even within the species, and it appears to be due to many biotic and the abiotic factors. So there are different biotic and the abiotic factors which are responsible, or which enhance, or which stimulate the fish to take up the you can say, migratory journey. So we shall be talking a little bit about the list. There is certain list of the migratory fishes that you should be knowing, that there are certain fishes which are particularly known for their migration, such as in the case of lampreys. Though many a times these very lampreys, they are not counted in the class spices, but many a times some of the books, they have written them in the class, you can say, super class spices, but they are written as, or they are known as the agnathostomes. So we do have the lampreys, that is Petromyzon. Then we do have the Antesphinus. Then we do have the Ceotria among the lampreys. Then among the eels, we do have the Indian longfin eel. We call it as the Anguilla bengalensis. Then we do have the shortfin eel. We call it as the Anguilla bicolor. Then we do have the common freshwater, or the European eel. We call it as the Anguilla. Then we do have the Anguilla vulgaris. We do have the American eel. We call it as the Anguilla rostrata. Then the hilsa is also a migratory fish. We call it as the hilsa elisha, and it is also known by the name of the genus Tenulosa. We call it as the hilsa elisha, or Tenulosa elisha. Then there are certain herrings. We call it as the Clopia herringus. These are also the migratory in their behavior. Then we do have the Samo salar. There are different kinds of the salmons: Atlantic salmon, Pacific salmon. We know it by the name of the Samu, or salmon, or Oncorhynchus. Then we do have the sturgeons, such as Accipenser. This is the sturgeon. This is the Accipenser. Then we do have the tuna. This is the tuna. That is the Thunus. Then we do have the mackerels, that is Scomber esox, or the Scomber. So they belong to the Scomber genus. So the herrings are salmon, sturgeons, tuna, mackerel. Then we do have the lampreys. Then Then Hilsa, these are the fishes which are mostly counted as the migratory fishes. Then another important thing is that what causes migration. What is the cause of the migration? We have studied, we have gone through this during the course of this very lecture, but a little bit of the brush up that what causes migration, that there are certain several factors such as physical, chemical and the biological factors which are known to cause the migration, which act as a stimulus for the migration, that include the temperature of the water, that rainfall, then the quality of the water depth, the pressure, the light intensity, photo period, turbidity, tides, currents. They are the abiotic factors which act as a stimulation to these very fishes. Any change in these very condition can stimulate the fish to take up the migratory journey. So we do have the chemical factors as well. Chemical factors such as the pH of the water. If there is a change in the pH of water, then the fish can take up the migratory journey. The salinity, dissolved oxygen, uh, carbon dioxide, then and dissolved organic and the inorganic substances, and the taste of the water. These are also the chemical factors which are responsible for the migration of the fish. Then there are certain biological factors as well which play an important role in the migration of the fish, such as food. Food is one of the important factors. Then attainment of the sexual maturity, that is after attaining the sexual maturity where they have to move. Then endocrine behavior, and the competitors and the predators, they are known to cause the fish migration. Now there are various studies wherein the scientists have worked on the hormonal role, or the role of the pituitary, or the role of the adenohypophysis, or the role of the different kinds of the, you can say, hormonal mechanisms in the, you can say, migratory behavior of the fish. But still the studies are incomplete, and the scientists have not yet concluded that what is the reason behind the exact, you can say, reaching up to the particular location of the, you can say, migration. Then several authors have given various reasons as to why fishes migrate, and one of them was the Northcote. In 1978, he tried to give the reasons of the migration in the case of fishes. That is, he said that the migration is carried upon, or migration, the fishes do migrate to optimize feeding, to avoid unfavorable conditions, to enhance the reproductive success, to possibly promote the colonization. So there are various factors which are responsible for the migration in the case of fishes, and these very four factors, they are known to be the important causes. Then then we should also be knowing that what are the advantages of the migration. That what is the advantage of the migration? If the fish is taking so much of the risk to migrate from the one place to another, then what is the advantage of the migration? According to the Nikolsky, the migration is an adaptation toward the abundance. So these very spanning are the nursery grounds. They may not have the enough food to maintain both the mature and the immature members of a large population. So it would be advantageous to have separate spawning, nursery and the feeding grounds. So that is why um, to have the separate spawning, nursery and the feeding grounds, the fishes do migrate from one place to another to optimize feeding. That is so that there may not be excessive competition among the members of the same species, so that there is less competition. That is why they separate their spawning, nursery and the feeding grounds. So this very fact, that is the fact that many commercial species, they are migratory. They support the view that the migration is an adaptation toward the sustenance as well. And also there appears to be some advantage to the species whose adults return to the spawn adult return to spawn in an area where the environmental conditions were similar to those under which they themselves survived when they were young. So that is why that is one important thing, that the parent spawning ground, it provides a means by which these favorable conditions may be exploited. That is, they are known to the conditions where they have thrived, and that is why these very favorable conditions, they must be exploited by the younger generation. So that is why they move from one place to another. So a return to the parent spawning ground, this provides a means by which these favorable conditions may be exploited. So thus, a better egg and the larval survival would lead to the greater number of the spawners on a particular ground. Then the fish are often dispersed widely over the large areas while feeding, but they congregate at the specific spawning ground. So during the feeding, they disperse, they move to far places in search of the food, but when they have to spawn, they together move simultaneously. They reach to a particular place, they reach a particular specific spawning ground to enhance their reproductive success. So the precise timing of the spawning migration, this ensures the simultaneous arrival of the sufficient members of both the sexes at one place to ensure the reproductive success of the group. So both males and females, if they reach in the greater numbers in a particular you can say spawning ground, this will ensure the greater reproductive success. They will lay more eggs, and simultaneously the more milk will be released by the males, and there will be a greater success rate in terms of their production. Now, what are the problems of the navigation? That what kind of the problem is faced during the navigation? Now, how these very fishes, they find their way in the huge expanses of the sea and reach their destinations, which lie thousands of the kilometers away. This is still a mystery, and it is believed that they orient by the position of the stars and the moon in the night sky and sun in the daytime to find the direction of the swimming. So because these very fishes, they migrate thousands of the kilometers and reach exactly the place where the parents had laid their eggs, the juveniles which come back to the feeding grounds, when they have to take this very breeding journey or spawning journey, they reach exactly the place where they were born. So how come they reach to the specific place? So this is still a mystery, and this, it has been experimentally proven by the many this A.S. Hessler, that the salmons are guided by the order of their parent stream during the journey. And Hassler has proved, he has tried to solve this very mystery, that he has experimentally proven that these very salmons, they are guided by the order of their parent during their return journey. So eels also, they can also migrate to the Sargasso Sea using the similar order maps. But the question is that how these leptocephali, that is the larvae of the eels, they find their way back to the river mouths, crossing the vast stretches of the this very Atlantic Sea. This is still a mystery. So the problem of the navigation is still a mystery, that how these very fishes, they find their way, except the experiment of the Hessler, where he has proven that the salmons or the eels, they are guided by the order of their parents. So this was all about the fish migration types, the causes, the problems of the navigation, the various kinds of fishes which do migrate, and how these very fishes migrate, and what are the advantages of the migration. And next we shall be talking about the examples of the different migration patterns in detail. We shall be talking about the complete life cycle of the eels, or the life cycle of the Atlantic salmon, in order to study the Catadromous migration and the Anadromous migration. And hope you enjoyed the lecture, and it is my request to you all to like and subscribe my channel, BioLearnia. Thank you very much.